Hello, hello. Welcome to another episode of Merging Minds. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking to Professor Lisa Meeden. Lisa is a professor in computer science at Swarthmore College. She received her PhD from Indiana University in computer science with a minor in cognitive science. She has been teaching at Swarthmore since 1994 and has helped develop the cognitive science program there. She regularly teaches artificial intelligence and is co-teaching a new course this semester with philosopher and ethicist Krista Thompson on responsible AI. The development of this course was funded by a grant from the National Humanities Center. Her research focuses on building developmental models for robot control using deep learning. Hi, Lisa. Thank you so much for making the time. It's really a pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you for having me.
And Lisa, I'd love to first ask you, how surprised are you about what we're experiencing as far as the development of AI at our current stage, given your trajectory as a computer scientist?
Yes, so I've been teaching for 30 years, and I think this is the most rapid improvement in AI that I've seen in my 30 years teaching. It's amazing how many advances just keeping coming one after the other. I always have told students that, passing the Turing test would be a long way off. And it seems like, large language models are really good at fooling people into thinking that they are, other humans. So I think we're kind of almost there. I think experts can still maybe suss out the fact that they're talking to a large language model, but I think the average citizen might not be able to suss it out very well.
And do you think that means maybe we need to create some new kind of Turing test or parameter, or do you think, let's say, the earlier definitions are still valid?
I mean, I think the Turing test was always a limited test in like really evaluating the intelligence of another entity. I think in order to really evaluate intelligence, you need to have kind of a shared space where you're interacting together, talking about something that you can both see and touch and manipulate. So I think it's a very limited kind of test, but it's still impressive that these systems are so fluent at language.
And does any of this speed of progress scare you? How do you feel about it in general?
Well, I think one of the interesting things about AI is it has these boom and bust phases that historically have happened again and again. Melanie Mitchell, in her book AI for Thinking Humans, talks about AI springs and winters. So, like, we're in a spring right now where things are happening and it's very exciting, and but there will be a winter to follow, I'm sure, which has happened every time in the past. So, I'm not frightened by it. I'm always more worried about how people will use AI than what AI will do on its own. I think the kind of misinformation campaign that can happen with large language models is very concerning. So it's really not about the AI, but how we use the AI to do bad things.
Can you talk about more about this misinformation scenario? How it plays out?
So you could imagine that in the upcoming election, it would be really easy to just flood social media with posts from fake people professing misinformation. And it might feel to someone in that social media space that there are all these individuals out in the world who believe a certain thing when it's really just a bunch of spam being created by someone using a large language model to do what they desire it to do.
And I guess I'm interested in your perspective in this. One of the things that I hear a lot and makes a lot of sense to me is that truth is a particularly hard concept for artificial intelligence or large language models, at least to grasp, because they're based on other information, and it's hard to often affirm any kind of categorical truths. I've read certain studies around the content available on the internet and how the truth to falsehood ratio has been increasing over the past decades. And can you tell us a little bit about that and why it is so hard to work with truth as a concept when it comes to these models?
So I think it's really important to understand what a large language model is really doing. I think a lot of people think of it like a Google search or something that is, based, grounded in something real, but it's really just being trained on a whole bunch of examples of text. And I just saw a talk by Emily Bender, who is one of the co-authors of the stochastic parrots paper. And she, when referring to what large language models produce, was very careful to always say it's producing synthetic text because it's artificial. It's not being grounded in the world in the way that humans are when we communicate with each other. When I'm communicating with you, I have an intent. I have some aim that I'm trying to solve. And when you're speaking with a large language model or interacting with one, you have to prompt it for you to get anything out of it. It has no internal aims or desires or goals. It's not interacting with a communicative purpose. And so I think that's a really big difference that we forget when we're interacting with these things, because we tend to imbue meaning on text that seems very fluent and makes sense. We tend to think of there being a mind behind that text, but there is no mind behind that text. It's just, as they say in this paper, a stochastic parrot. It's parroting back to you patterns that it learned from seeing millions and millions of examples of text.
And do you have any opinion on whether either if it's possible or not, and if it's the right path or not to somehow label the synthetic versus non-synthetic text available to us? How do you see that?
I mean, I think that would be a great thing to include, like in any synthetically generated images or synthetically generated text. Anything that's coming out of AI, it would be really nice to have a watermark that would indicate to you that that thing has been generated by AI. Whether we can do that in such a way that it can't be tampered with, I think that's still something that's being looked into and investigated. But I think ultimately we will figure out a way, hopefully, to watermark these things so that people know that they're interacting with an AI system.
But let's say it gets a little bit more granular than that. Let's say I'm working, and I'll illustrate a little bit our use case as far as how we're working with large language models. So we're trying to use few shot learning to feed a very specific context to a large language model in a given language scenario. So we'll tell the large language model, this is the text in English, or this is the Italian translation provided by Google Machine Translation. This is what we found through semantic search in our knowledge library for this client. This is what are their key terms or their brand terms. Based on all of that, what is the most plausible translation? And that's what's being fed to the translator. And based on their changes, that's going to change the next context for the next prompt. So it's this interactive scenario. And in this scenario like that, for instance, where you have a pretty high degree of human interaction, right? It's beyond like a simple prompt with a large response. It's really very granular. How do you see that in terms of watermarking or authorship? Do you see that as more machine translated, or machine generated, human generated, hybrid? How do you see a scenario like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there could be a continuum of degrees of how much human interaction was taking place when the AI was interacted with. And we could imagine a watermark that might say, this was a collaboration with a human, or this was a fully AI generated thing, or this was, and there's different ways that a human could interact. Like they could be checking it after the fact for clarity and truthfulness, or they could be collaborating with some kind of mechanism that's built into the program. So there'd be different levels of human interaction, but I could imagine that we could watermark the level of human interaction to some degree as well.
So let's say in a hypothetical scenario, maybe this is 67% human or 34% synthetic or something like that.
I mean, yeah, maybe it would be hard to get to that level of percentage. Maybe it would be like a 50-50 or a
An
25,
approximation.
75, but not super like 17.5% human or something like that.
Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah, I guess in some scenarios it's very clear cut, right? If you provide a large language model with a very small prompt, and based on that, it gives you a very significant image or a very significant few paragraphs of text. To me, it's pretty clear. Okay, this is machine generated. But often, if you're iterating very significantly and providing very contextualized prompts, then it becomes a lot more of a shared collaboration. At least it would seem to me. But do you see the opportunity? I guess, do you think it's possible, given this synthetic nature that you just described of large language models, of being kind of detached from a contextual, cultural scenario, interpersonal scenario? Do you think it's possible to train them at some point for truth telling, or is that too far fetched?
I would have to be a very different kind of model than what is being used right now, because all that's going into these models right now is text. And just they're really, think of them as like giant prediction machines. They're just trying to predict, given the text that you've shown me so far and the text that I've produced so far, what would be a logical next word, next sentence to that would be coherent with what you've already given me. So it really, the way I think of what a large language model is like, is I'm a roboticist. I think about how a large language model is like, if you're a person who has spent your whole life in a closet, which is completely dark, and you're wearing headphones, and all you are given is streams of text, and that's all you know about life. You've never touched anything, you've never seen anything, you've never heard anything. You have no connection to the world other than these symbolic pieces of text. What I would say is you are not grounded, you're not situated, you're not connected to the world. So your understanding of things is extremely bizarre, because all you are understanding is, if you're understanding at all, is just pure syntactic relationships, statistical relationships between words. But you have no concept of what those words mean other than how they're used in juxtaposition with other words.
That's a terrifying but very clarifying metaphor. I love it in the sense that I think it's very, very, very clarifying. I do want to ask you though, even like these relationships are syntactical as you describe them, but they emulate semantic capabilities. But deep down at their core, they're still syntactical, they're mathematical, they're not. At what point do you think these things, actually, be even before what point, do they have the potential to become at some point semantic relationships, or is would that require a completely different kind of model?
I think it would. I mean, I'm very much a person who thinks embodiment in AI in general is really important. I think a lot of AI models are what I would describe as completely disembodied. They have no connection to the world. They are using symbolic information without a grounding for what that symbol is really meaning or attached to in the world. So I could imagine a system which is a robot, which is interacting with the world and hearing people speak about, just like you would co-play with a young child, a toddler. Let's make a stack of blocks. Oh, put the blue one on the top. Let's knock it down. Like if the robot was interacting with the world and hearing speech, and or even being fed speech via like a transcriber, I think it would start to get to that kind of connection between understanding what's really happening, what words mean in the world connected to your body. I think that's really essential to how we learn words.
So semantics, in the way you see it, is, or the correct way. I don't know. I'm kind of ignorant as that, but it's more about being able to correlate and ground concepts to an outside world, and not just concepts within themselves. Like even if you correlate concepts within themselves, from what you're describing, that's still not semantic. That's still somewhat
There has to
syntactic.
be there's a famous philosopher named Stephen Harned who came up with this problem, which he called the symbol grounding problem. If you have symbols in your AI system, they have to be connected to something. And if they're not connected to something, it's just their interrelationships with each other. And so, where do you make that connection to the outside world?
And at what point, and that's super interesting. I mean, I guess I have been making a key misconception or miscommunication, because when I think about these models, and I differentiate, for instance, in our space, right? For many years, we had machine translation models that were first rule based, and they became more statistically driven, and they evolved. But it was always very clear that they couldn't emulate any kind of semantic awareness. It was, they would make very embarrassing mistakes, very literal translations, and things like that.
Mhm.
And with large language models, even though they're not semantically aware, they can pretend to be pretty well. Like, they can pretend to understand that in this context, you should use maybe the word football and not another word to describe that object, because in that context of words, it makes more sense. But that's, let's say, a synthetic semantic emulation, but still syntactically driven. Am I correct in the
Yeah,
assessment?
I think I think until AI models are grounded in the world and have some understanding of meaning, they're going to always make these kind of mistakes that you're mentioning. It's just as we fed them huge amounts of text, the amount of syntactic information is richer, and so they aren't making the silly mistakes, the obvious mistakes that made it clear that they really weren't understanding anything. It's easier to fool us into thinking they're understanding more than they are. But I still think they're going to continue to make really have deep misunderstandings about what they're writing about, because they really don't have that meaning connection.
So it's just basically, it's a richer level of syntax, but still syntax. Not, it doesn't cross that threshold towards semantic. So, in my understanding, if I'm understanding you correctly, you almost need some level of consciousness to have semantic capabilities, or am I like?
I mean, I don't know that it's necessarily consciousness. It's just this connection to the world, embodiment, some kind
Right.
of way to
Okay.
connect syntax to meaning. So let me give you an example. There's some famous tests that some symbolic AI people came up with. So I want to give like a large language model a sentence, and I'm going to change it just slightly, and the meaning will completely change. So an example would be Sam was painting a picture of shepherds and sheep, but they ended up looking like dogs. So, in that sentence, what does the pronoun they refer to? Sam was painting a picture of shepherds and sheep, but they ended up looking like dogs.
Right.
So, what
It,
would you?
it could be the shepherd and the sheep, or just the sheep.
So, which do you think is more likely if you were
Just the
chatting with
sheep,
someone?
probably.
Probably the what?
The sheep ended up looking like dogs.
Right, because they have four legs and they're
Right.
both animals. So, one, then you could change the sentence and say, Sam painted a picture of shepherds and sheep, but they ended up looking like golfers. So now who is the they referring to?
Right.
So we know that shepherds often hold like a staff, and when you're golfing, you often hold the pin. So you're probably meaning that Sam wasn't very good at drawing people, and it ended up the shepherds ended up looking like golfers. So I've given this test to ChatGPT, and it will say something like, well, they both ended up looking like it doesn't do very well at this task. It basically fails at this task. And so we're changing a single word at the end of the sentence, and it completely changes who that pronoun refers to. And in order to make that connection, you really need to understand things about how things work in the world. Um, that when and one of the things ChatGPT said was, well, Sam's probably not a very good painter, and maybe he was being artistic, and it came up with this like paragraph of explanation that was really irrelevant. So I just think that really basic things like that are still a struggle because it's lacking that meaning connection.
Right. So it's disembodied. And if we go back to your closet metaphor, which I love, what's the path? Is robotics the path to this embodiment leaving the closet? Am I understanding that correctly in
I
your
mean, that's
understanding?
that's what I would argue, but I'm a roboticist, so I'm probably biased. But yeah, I mean, I think for to get to general AI, which is kind of the holy grail that a lot of AI people would be shooting for, if we really want something that's intelligent and adaptable and can do more than one thing. I mean, AI is traditionally been excellent at extremely constrained tasks. So we have a great chess playing program or a Go playing for, like because it's a very constrained set of rules and you can understand everything you need to know about it without having any connection to the world. But AI struggles when you give it more and more open ended tasks because there's so much more information that comes to play in trying to solve an open ended task. And what's amazing about humans is how adaptable we are to I know how to play a couple games, you bring in a new game and I can learn how to play that game, or you teach me something new that's related to stuff I already know. It's really hard for AI to do those kind of like sort of lateral moves. It's very good at constrained situations, but not at those kind of big open ended situations. So I think ultimately we're going to have to build something that goes through a long developmental process like human babies do to learn about the world and connect things conceptually.
And if I'm understanding correctly, is that the key difference between what people refer to as artificial intelligence and artificial general intelligence is this lateral movement capability?
Yeah. So the ability, like we are lifelong learners, we're constantly learning new things, we're constantly adapting. And most AI systems are trained and then the training ends and we deploy them to solve some task. They aren't lifelong learners constantly developing.
And in your opinion, to what degree do you think the shock, let's say, that a lot of people experience, or the fear that they experience around this jump in response quality that we began seeing with GPT-3 and then GPT-4, 4.5, to what degree do you think this is something that is just emulated by these models, or to what degree do you think that there is some intelligence there for people to be afraid of, as far as, and I mean this in the context of maybe not having so much professional relevance in the future, maybe for people who used to write or who used to draft contracts and so on.
I mean, it seems like what it's good for right now, like the tasks that it could be really helpful for, is kind of being a partner with a human. So, like, let's say you kind of have writer's block and you're trying to write an email to someone and it's a hard email to write. And you're like, here's an email I'm trying. Can you help me make this sound more persuasive? Or can you help me make this sound kinder? Or can you help me in different ways. So I think that large language models will be really good at that, at kind of giving an assistance to a human, but where the human is still in charge. The human is the one deciding what they want to say, and they're taking what comes back and editing it, fixing it, and making it appropriate. Um, I think it's good at summarizing things, though you can't always trust it because it might leave out important things or change things a little bit. So the way I see it as being really useful right now is very much in partnership with a person, but I don't think it should be used like it shouldn't be like someone you go to like for a doctor with advice. Like we wouldn't want WebMD ChatGPT because it's just making stuff up, right? I mean, there's no guarantees that what it's telling you is accurate. So we shouldn't be. I think the thing that worries me is how many companies are jumping on board and saying, "Oh, look how fluent this is! I can now replace people with this tool, and it'll save me all this money." But the tool is not something you can depend on to give the correct answers.
Yeah, and I really want to stress something that I'm learning from you today, which I find fascinating, is when people talk about these models hallucinating, it's based on what you're telling me. I think that's almost like a misconception, in the sense that it's presupposing, the hallucination is presupposing that there is some level of understanding in the first place, and then the hallucination is a deviation from that understanding. But in your description, in your metaphor of the closeted being who never saw the world, there's nothing but hallucinations. The only thing is that most of them sound very plausible. But
Exactly. Yes.
is that correct
Yeah.
in what I'm
I think
understanding?
that's a really good way to think about it. Like, all the model is doing is predicting reasonable ways to complete the prompt that you've provided. So it has been trained on lots of coherent text, lots of also biased and incoherent text, and so it's all an hallucination in a way. It's all just making predictions based on what it's seen before. So I also really like this stochastic parrot metaphor. It's parroting back to you in a random way things that it has seen before. If you put in a prompt like, "Tell me the rules of football," well, it knows it's seen lots of documents about football, and it will just start producing information based on things that it has seen about football. And it might make up some rules that aren't true, like, you can, I don't know, kick a field goal backwards or something. Who knows? But I mean, it's just basically predicting using all the information that it had before.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I think I have a lot of misgivings when it comes to how we anthropomorphize these models, but it's also inevitable and helpful if you can do it in a contextual way, like you were describing. And I think a lot of the anthropomorphizations I see ascribe way more agency to these models than they actually have, and then that creates a much deeper sense of fear. And a good example is this idea of hallucination. Is it's not that they're hallucinating all the time anyway. It's just sometimes they get it really wrong, and it's part of the framework, right? It's not
Yeah,
an
I think
accident.
one of the really interesting things is, like, I mean, as an academic, I write a lot of papers, and a really important part is the bibliography at the end, where you cite all the related work. And so if you ask ChatGPT to write a paper for you, it'll just create a bunch of fake citations, because it's like, well, I've seen lots of papers and they all look like this at the end. They have numbers, and then they have authors and years and journals and titles. And so it just makes up a bunch of mishmash of plausible things that it's seen before. So it has no sense of the fact that that whole unit goes together and is marking something real in the world.
Yeah, I think that's all very helpful. Just to bring you back a little bit to our context as far as translations go, I think part of the challenge that we see is that, just like you described, in when you really constrain the context and the situation, you see pretty solid results from these models. So in translation, it's a case where you can really, really constrain the context. You can say, this is a legal contract, and this is the sentence above and the sentence below, and this is the kind of contract, and this is the key terminology that was mapped. And in those situations, it can be very, very helpful for a human to use as a tool. But the challenge we see is that in our space, translators are typically not techies. So they're looking at basically a lot of these headlines. They're not spending time analyzing what these models are or not. And they're basically looking at them. They're looking for ways to discredit the models. And you can discredit these models, especially from the truth perspective, really quickly. It's like, oh, it hallucinates, it says crazy things. But then they ignore the fact that for these very small constrained tasks, they can be very useful. In your opinion, what, if anything, what can people think as far that can help them use these things more as tools and less as adversaries?
Well, it's interesting in your constrained use case, because I'm assuming you haven't trained your own separate version of a large language model. You're using a
Correct.
large language model, but then just asking it about this very constrained set of questions that you have. If you could really train your own model only on, if you were interested in, let's say, translating English to Italian, if you could train it on a whole bunch of side by side English, Italian texts that you knew were already good translations, I think you could come up with a pretty good model that would do a pretty good job syntactically of generating the kind of things that you want. The problem is that you're not building a model from scratch. You're taking the chat GPT or the model that exists already and has been trained on you don't know what, and then you're asking it questions on the thing that you're interested in. So I think in that use case, there's always going to be the issue that it's going to say, perhaps give you answers that you wish it wouldn't, that maybe have bias in them, or racist answers or inappropriate answers. So I think one of the things that will be interesting going forward is if people set up ways so that we could fix the training to be what we want it to be, rather than not having any knowledge of what the training set is. Like, I think that's one of the big problems right now with data sets and AI, is that it's a black box. Like, no one has to reveal to us what the training set was. And if I don't approve of that training set, I don't have any way of knowing that. So I think a big push coming in the future will be that these companies are going to have to be more forthright about where the data sets come from. Do they have the right to use these data sets? Have they been cleaned and inappropriate things removed from the data sets, and so on? So that's a big issue that's coming. I don't know if I've addressed your question yet. Could you
No,
restate your question?
you have. I do have a few follow-ups, but one of them is that it doesn't seem, based on what I saw happening with Google a few weeks ago, doesn't seem that easy to clean these data sets. I mean, it seems that sometimes in the attempt to clean them, they actually introduce even more bias and even more potentially racism and other kinds of issues. And can you describe a little bit why it's so hard to preserve data integrity in these situations?
So, one of the things about these models, and one of the reasons they're so successful, is that when you talk about deep learning, it's all these layers stacked on top of each other. And so, the number of parameters in one of these systems can be on the order of a billion or billions. And so, when you have that many parameters to train, you have to have a lot of data. Otherwise, you're going to have a system that overfits to the limited amount of data that you have. So the bigger, the deeper the learning system is, the more training you need. And so it's like this data hungry animal beast that you've got to feed all this data to. And when you have to feed all this data, it's hard to be careful with it. You just need so much of it that what people do is they just scrape the internet for data. And then that's the most expedient way to like get all this data that you need. And so it's just the sheer volume of it and scale of it is such that it's really hard to be careful, and it's hard to scrutinize everything and make sure that you don't have any bias.
And I agree with you, by the way. I think that a huge next step is going to be having transparency over exact and control and governance over exactly what any given model is being fed. I agree. I guess, but just going back a bit to our use case and context, we don't, because it's so restrictive, and we're not asking, let's say, we're already offering, let's say, a rough draft from a machine translation engine. So it could be Google or AWS or Microsoft machine translation that's working as a syntactical rough draft. We're offering it past translations for that very specific kind of content and specific client. So we're really like constraining it as much as we can.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't, at least for now, I mean, we've been doing this for like almost a year and a half now. We don't see situations where it's producing unexpected or really weird responses, introducing things that are outside that very clear context. But even then, the key thing that kind of boggles my mind is that I translate and I use our tool to translate, and I can be a lot faster with it. And I don't mind the fact that a lot of that there is this interaction between me and the model, and with every change that I make, I'm changing the next response that it's going to provide me in the next sentence and so on. I kind of actually enjoy it. I find it pleasurable, and it's okay. But for a lot of translators, the fact that they're no longer the ones typing things, that it's no longer coming from their minds, and that it's no longer, they see this as an attack on everything they've learned over sometimes decades.
Mhm.
And do you see any possible way of reframing this in a more positive kind of context, or is it just a brutal thing really, and I'm just too much of an optimist?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, I'm feeling it as a coder because, now GitHub, which is what a lot of people who write code will put their code up for other people to share and see. GitHub now has autopilot, which will like write code for you. And it seems to write it really well. It can do many of our intro computer science problem sets without a problem, which is a little concerning for how we're going to be teaching going forward if we have no control over how students access this. So I think it's an issue that is a lot of us are facing across a whole bunch of industries. Is this going to replace people, or could we find a way to make it, like I say, a partner rather than a replacement? Like I could imagine translating a legal document would be very different than translating poetry or translating a novel, because there's themes and metaphors and stylistic aspects that would be subtle and harder for a machine to get right, I think. And I think a person would be really important to be evaluating, like, is the tone of this poem correct in the translation? Is the feeling that you get, is it the emotions that are evoked, that kind of thing, I think would be harder for a machine to get correct, and have that sort of same sense of, I don't know, feeling that comes out of the writing. So I think there's always going to be a place for humans in the loop, but I do agree that our role may be changing. Like in some industries, we're going to have to maybe adapt to the fact that it's relatively easy to do some things now, and maybe it's better to let the machine do the easy stuff and have us work on the more interesting, higher level, more complicated stuff.
And that leads me to a great question. Well, not, I don't know if it's great, but it's interesting to me. Do have you given? You mentioned you're already thinking about how you would teach computer science for these intro level courses where an GPT-4 may do as good as your best students would. How do you have any ideas of how you would do this?
No, I mean, I think we just realized this semester how good it is at writing our intro course code. So it's something that we as a department are just starting to wrestle with. And so I don't have any great answers for you. And I think as a college, like I teach at Swarthmore College, you're an alum of Swarthmore College, and we care very much about teaching. And so I think it's something as a college we're struggling with too. And because students are using ChatGPT even when we ask them not to help them write their papers. So it's something I think that higher ed is going to have to deal with.
If you, I also have no idea how things would be necessarily taught differently, but if anything, I would expect things to become students to be in the long run more challenged than less challenged, because ultimately, we're not, it's like math, right? Instead of making the analogy, instead of testing people for arithmetic, they're going to be tested for derivatives, because, or something that's more challenging, or something that builds on that. But I guess a question that I have is, and you touched on this in a few of your previous answers, is that you need expertise to be able to, and experience to validate. You need that embodiment in the outside world to be able to validate these responses that you're getting. So when it comes to coding, for instance, if you're an experienced coder, you can go through the code that it's generating and you can pick up, oh, this was really good, but it made this mistake here and this mistake there, and or you can fix a few things, and it can really expedite your time. So it's, in that sense, I think it's easier to see it as a tool. But if you're starting out and you're like, well, I'm starting and this thing is already way better than I'll be in for the next 3-4 years, that's a little bit intimidating. And I think it could potentially, let's say, discourage a few people from getting in, from breaking into the field and really developing, because at least maybe I'm wrong, but the only way I see people really learning is going through that period of blood, sweat, and tears where things don't make sense and you're really trying hard and not, struggling, and then eventually you come out of the other side with some level of wisdom over all of that. But I would love to know from you, like, do you have any ideas as to how to get people through this, like, initial learning curve or hump, so that they can emerge on the other sides as capable of guiding or instructing some of these models?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the what I've heard from people who have used autopilot to help them code is that it really helps if you're already an expert coder, because then you can kind of direct it in different ways. Like, I need a function, or I need a set of object oriented objects that will represent this piece of the program. Can you get started for me? And it'll kind of generate a draft, and then the person who's the expert can see, oh, I see there's a problem here, and fix it, and so on. And I think you're right that a beginning programmer just doesn't have any expertise yet. That's why they're a beginning programmer. So they really, I mean, I think my feeling is, the argument I'm going to make to students is that you have to go through the blood, sweat, and tears to get to the place where you're able to be a partner with a tool like this. And if you don't go through that process, you're not going to be able to use that tool effectively, and you're going to make mistakes that will be hard for you to figure out because you don't understand what you're doing. I'm not sure how persuasive that argument is, but I mean, I think
It
that,
makes sense to me a lot. I think, as far as persuasion goes, I don't know if you agree with this, but I think something that may shift or should shift is the incentive structure in grading. Because if the incentive structure is to get the right answer or to write the best possible paper, I'm going to feel very inclined to resorting to GPT, whatever, 4 or 5, whatever, the best possible model out there, because I want to get the best possible grade. And it's going to be, it's going to be, at the best case scenario, very tempting not to do that. And, if I'm very, very honorable and adhering to the honor code that I swore by and all of that, sure. But fact is, most people are going to feel very, very tempted about it. But if somehow we could shift the incentive to actually doing the hard work, regardless of whether you're getting the answer right or wrong, that could be, at least maybe I'm wrong, but I think that could be actually really beneficial to education in general.
yeah, I'm in the middle of what we have this really interesting thing at Swarthmore where we do inquiry groups, and we can form an inquiry group around lots of different subjects. And we now have a teaching and learning commons, which helps facilitate this. And so I'm in an inquiry group about alternative grading and how to think of different ways that you could incentivize students to learn and not be so focused on a grade. I think one really nice way you could do this with programs, it's very time consuming, but you could sit down with each student and have them walk through the code with you. Like, all right, explain to me your solution. What is each function doing? Why did you decide to design it this way? How is this particular function contributing to the overall program? I mean, I think if they really struggle with that, then it's clear that they aren't really understanding what's happening. And anyone who wrote the code should be able to, or even if they did write it in partnership with ChatGPT, if they understand it enough to be able to explain it to me how it works, then I feel like that's really what I ultimately want them to do.
Yeah, I mean, again, maybe I'm too much of an optimist, but I do see the opportunity to promote greater focus on the building blocks and the understanding of the concepts, and not on just being able to repeat these concepts or produce these concepts in an exam or in any given kind of exercise.
So
But
it could be more like an oral exam.
yeah, yeah, that would make more sense to me,
Yeah.
at least. And but I think also, I don't know if it's possible, but let's say, for instance, if you're able to measure time put in, effort put in to trying to understand that, and that being a significant component, because part of the problem we have now is it's very hard to measure effort. Like, well, how much did you study? I don't know, where we, how are we logging this time? How are we recording this time? How are we keeping track of whether you're using this time efficiently or not? And if somehow we were able to capture these data points, and without being too invasive from a privacy perspective, obviously, but if we were able to, at least hypothetically, measure learning at a more core level rather than the results themselves, that could lead to, in a few generations, people who are a lot more anchored in deeper understanding as opposed to just people who learned how to get A's.
Yeah, I think it's hard though because some people just pick up on certain concepts really quickly, and it just their facility is just easier than for other folks. But sometimes the folks who do it slowly and it takes them time actually understand it deeply. Eventually, it just takes them a lot longer. So I don't think it's really a time amount. I think judging effort wouldn't be really the right place to look, but I think trying to judge understanding rather than just recapitulating something
Right.
fact.
Yeah, and I guess I was just trying to show some examples of data points and that could be cross correlated to deconstruct understanding. And like you said, maybe my understanding is taking me 5 hours and your understanding is taking you 50 minutes, but that's one data point. And maybe another data point is the kind of explanation that I'm able to produce. And another data point could be how I'm able to cross correlate concepts. And we would build on that. But I just think that eventually there's not, because large language models allow the cross correlation of so many more data points than we were previously able to do. In theory, we would be able to deconstruct understanding from a behavioral kind of capacity more clearly, which could lead to potentially a completely alternative form of evaluation that would still have a grade, but the grade would be built more on um, behavioral inputs than and cognitive inputs than purely how well you did on an exam.
Yeah, yeah.
And I guess building on that, Lisa, my question is really, when you look now into 2024, 25, 26, I've heard so many people with so many different predictions and outlooks on what these next steps and rollouts will be. Also, as far as what kind of regulations may look like and what may kick in, how do you see the unfolding of these next few months or years?
So one of the things that people have talked about in the past, which I think is a really interesting idea, like when you go to the grocery store to buy some food, there's a label, and the label has to tell you what's in the food, how many calories it has, how much fat, how much protein, how much carbohydrates. So would it be nice if data sets had labels and they would tell you, where did this data come from? How is this data collected? What does this data cover? What does this data not cover? So having kind of like a nutrition label for data sets so that we would have a way to judge, like if I'm going to build a machine learning system, my machine learning system always is going to need data. Where am I going to get that data from? So first of all, I want to make sure I have good data, and I want to know where it came from and how it was collected, and if the people whose data is being used agreed to have their data be used, and so on. And so then not only does the data have to have a nutrition label, but now my machine learning system has to have a label that tells you how I trained it, how much data I used, and so on. So I think there's going to be a lot more demand that these systems have transparency about these things. I think there should be a lot more demand about that. And I think people should have data like the fact that I've posted pictures on Facebook or Instagram. I should be allowed to say, you cannot use my pictures. I should be able to be on Instagram and still not have my pictures be sucked into data sets to be training machine learning systems if I don't want them to be. So I think there's going to be a lot more regulation around when I use an application, what are my protections with the data that I have provided to that application. Um, I think that it's going to be really complicated, and it's one of the things that I see is that a lot of people, regular folks who aren't in tech, don't really understand, don't have the right intuitions behind how these systems work. And so it's hard for them to make informed decisions about what would be a good way to go in the future. So one of my big projects I'm excited about is I'm building this toolkit, which I call AI TK, with a couple collaborators, and we're trying to make things easy for people to experiment with so they can get some intuition about what does a machine learning system really do? Like, what does a data set look like? How do I train one of these systems? What's going on? So I think having some concrete hands-on experience with machine learning gives people a little bit more knowledge and the ability to say, oh, wait a minute, I didn't understand that. So for example, in my class on responsible AI that I'm teaching, we got to train a neural network from scratch. And every time you train it, you get different results. And all the students were like, wait a minute, I didn't know that. I thought like if you gave it the same data, you would always get the same answer out. And every neural network starts with random weights. So every time you train it, you get slightly different answers. And so that was like an intuition that none of them had had about how machine learning works. So I think there needs to be a lot more opening up of AI to understanding for the average citizen to get a better sense of what's really going on.
So transparency, as far as the data sets, how the models operate, that's a big thing. But from what I understand, maybe I'm wrong, but how about transparency regarding the rationale for any given response? Is that something possible?
Yeah. So, yeah, for example, if you're building a system, if you're a bank and you have a system that decides whether someone gets a loan or not, it would be nice if you're denied a loan to be able to say, well, why was I denied a loan? Like, what aspects of my financial record are you denying me a loan based on? And so I think that, yes, transparency in the decision itself is important as well.
But is that possible given the closet metaphor where the transparency is, in that case, is also kind of made up or disembodied from reality, or is that something
I think it
possible?
would have to be a different kind of training system. So imagine that let's think about an image. Like let's say we're trying to see if someone has a gun. We have some kind of surveillance camera and it's taking images, and we're trying to recognize if someone has a gun. It shouldn't just say yes there's a gun in the image or no there isn't. If it says there's a gun in an image, it should put a bounding box around where that gun is so that a human looking at that image can say, oh, I agree, it looks like there's a gun there, or that's not a gun, that's like a water gun, or that's somebody, with a racket in their hand or something like that. So I
Mhm.
think that there can be ways to make the output more explainable, that is just making the output be more than just a decision, but also information about how that decision was arrived at.
That makes a lot of sense. And Lisa, this is all super fascinating, illuminating. I've learned a ton from you today, so I'm very grateful for your time. If people want to get to know more about AITK and more about your work, what's the best way for people to reach out or get to know more of your work?
So yeah, I'm easily Googleable on the web. So my last name is not a very common name. So if you just search for me, Lisa Meeden, you'll find my homepage, and there should be links to papers I've written and also AITK from there.
Perfect. Well, Lisa, thank you so much for your time. It's really been a pleasure, an honor. I'm very grateful for everything that you've taught us today, and look forward to catching up in person soon.
All right. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.